My name is Ellie. I am 28 years old, and I have spent the better part of the last 3 years trying to figure out how to explain what happened at my sister's wedding without sounding like the villain of my own story. Because that's the thing about real life, the villain usually doesn't know they're the villain, and the person who gets hurt the most is usually the one standing in the corner wondering what they did wrong. I've started this post 6 times. 6. I've typed it out and deleted it and typed it again and sat back in my chair with my coffee going cold and stared at the ceiling and thought, nobody is going to believe this. But I've also talked to my therapist about it, and to my best friend Petra, and to James, who is the kind of man my grandmother would have loved, and every single one of them has said the same thing: you need to get this out. You need to write it down. Not for the internet, not for the validation, not for the comments, but for yourself. So here I am, writing it down. For myself. And if you're reading this and you're somewhere in your mid to late 20s and you grew up in a family where you were always the second best kid, the quiet one, the one who tried too hard and got thanked too little, I want you to know before we even begin, this story has a real ending. Not a perfect one, but a real one, and sometimes real is better than perfect. Let me start at the beginning. The real beginning, not the dramatic wedding day beginning, because that moment only makes sense if you understand what came before it. I grew up in a town called Harlow Creek, which is exactly the kind of small town its name suggests. A place where everybody knows your family, your grandmother's maiden name, your father's mistakes, and the rumours about your mother's college years all at once. There were 2 traffic lights and a diner called Benny's that made the best pie in 3 counties, and a church that my family attended every Sunday with the kind of performative devotion that I would only come to understand as performance much later in life. My parents are Robert and Diane Calloway. My father, Robert, is a man who was once handsome in the way that old photographs tell you about, broad-shouldered, square-jawed, the kind of man who coached Little League and shook hands firmly and laughed loudly at his own jokes. By the time I was old enough to really see him, he was something softer and sadder than those photographs suggested. He worked in insurance, which he called a noble profession, in a way that made it clear he didn't entirely believe that himself. He drank more than he should, not in a dramatic, falling-down way, but in the slow, steady way that becomes furniture in a house. You stop noticing it until one day you trip over it in the dark. My mother, Diane, is a different story entirely. My mother is the kind of woman who is always right, not because she's always correct, but because she has the remarkable ability to reshape the narrative of any event, so that she ends up on the side of righteousness by the time the conversation is over. She is charming and beautiful in a faded way, like a quilt that was once gorgeous and is still lovely, but has lost some of its original colour. She loves my sister Vanessa with a completeness and a totality that I spent most of my childhood trying to understand, and then trying to earn, and then, finally, trying to stop grieving. Vanessa is 4 years older than me. She's 32 now. When we were children, she was the sun around which our family orbited, bright and warm, and absolutely unaware of the gravitational pull she exerted on everyone around her. Vanessa was beautiful and popular and good at tennis and better at smiling, and our parents looked at her the way people look at something they made and are proud of. She wasn't cruel to me, not exactly. She was just indifferent in the particular way that only older sisters can be, the kind of indifference that says you exist, and that's fine, but you're not really my concern. I was the quiet one, the reader, the one who got straight A's and received a good job, Ellie, and a brief nod before the conversation shifted back to whatever Vanessa was doing that week. I was the one who helped with dishes without being asked and remembered everyone's birthdays and sent thank you cards and tried, with the diligence of a child who has not yet learned that some things cannot be earned, to be enough. I was never quite enough. Not in the way that Vanessa was enough. I want to be clear, I'm not telling you this to paint myself as some tragic figure. I had food and shelter and safety, and there are people in this world whose childhoods were defined by things so much worse than feeling like the second best kid in a family of 4. I know that. I've spent time sitting with that knowledge. But emotional neglect is a funny thing, and it does funny things to a child, and one of those things is that it teaches you to take up as little space as possible, to need as little as possible, to expect as little as possible. And when you spend 20-some years training yourself to need nothing, you get very good at it. You get so good at it that you stop noticing what's being taken from you because you've already decided you weren't entitled to it in the first place. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The person at the center of all of this is not me, and it's not Vanessa, and it's not my parents. The person at the center of all of this is my grandmother. Her name was Rose. Rose Calloway. She kept the Calloway name even after my grandfather passed, because she said it was hers now as much as it had ever been his, and she wasn't in the habit of giving back things that belonged to her, was the most remarkable human being I have ever known. And I don't mean remarkable in the greeting card way, the way people say it about the elderly out of obligation. I mean it in the way that stops you in your chest. She was remarkable the way certain pieces of music are remarkable, not because they're loud, but because they get into you somehow and change the way the air inside you feels. She was 78 when she died. She'd lived in Harlow Creek her whole life, in the same white house on Sycamore Lane with the red front door and the garden that she tended like a religion. She grew roses, obviously. She also grew tomatoes and zucchini and lavender, and one stubborn patch of sunflowers that came back every year in a different spot, which she said was because they were free spirits, and she respected that about them. She had a storyteller's mind and a pragmatist's mouth. She could spin a yarn that would keep you sitting at her kitchen table until midnight, and she could also look at a problem and cut straight to the middle of it with 2 sentences while everyone else was still circling the edges. She was funny in the dry way that takes you a second to catch up to. She was honest without being cruel. She was generous without being a pushover. She was, in short, everything that I aspired to be and often failed at being. And she loved me. Not more than she loved Vanessa. I want to be careful about that claim because I genuinely don't believe she played favourites, and even if she did, I would not want to be the kind of person who holds that over a dead woman who cannot defend herself. But she loved me in a way that I could feel, in a way that landed on me and stayed there, warm and solid and unconditional. When I was with Grandma Rose, I didn't have to be impressive or beautiful or the best at tennis. I just had to be Ellie. I used to go to her house after school on Wednesdays. My mother would drop me off, probably grateful for the quieter car, and I would sit at Rose's kitchen table and do my homework while she made tea and told me things. She told me about her childhood during hard years, when her family had almost nothing, and she'd worn the same pair of shoes for 3 years until her feet ached all the time. She told me about meeting my grandfather Harold, who she described as the most frustrating and wonderful man God ever assembled, and how she'd almost turned him down twice because she was afraid of how much she felt for him. She told me about the early years of their marriage, which were lean and difficult, and sometimes frightening, and how they'd built their life piece by piece with the specific stubbornness of people who had decided they were going to make something real. She told me things she didn't tell the rest of the family. Not secrets exactly, just the unedited version. The version that included fear and failure and the days she'd wanted to quit something and almost had. I understood, even as a child, that she was giving me something. I wasn't sure what to call it then. I understand now, she was giving me the truth. The ring. Oh, the ring. I should tell you about the ring. It was a sapphire. Not a diamond. Grandma Rose had been offered diamonds and had chosen a sapphire because, as she told me once, diamonds are what people choose when they want to look rich, and sapphires are what people choose when they actually know what they want. The stone was deep blue, the colour of the sky right after sunset, set in a band of white gold that had worn smooth in the way old, beloved things do. It had been my great-grandmother's, and her mother's before that, and then it had been Rose's, and she wore it every single day of her life on the ring finger of her left hand, even after my grandfather died, even in the last years when her fingers had swollen with arthritis, and she'd had to have it resized. She told me about it when I was 9 years old, sitting at her kitchen table on a Wednesday afternoon, and I remember asking her if she would leave it to me someday, the way only a 9-year-old can ask such a question without any awareness of what the question actually contains. She looked at me for a long moment, the way she did when she was deciding something, and then she said, "Yes, Ellybug, that ring is for you." I carried that knowledge the way you carry something precious when you're a child, not carefully, not anxiously, but with a simple certainty, the way you carry the knowledge that the sun will come up tomorrow. It was just true. It was a thing that was going to happen. It was part of how the world was ordered. I didn't talk about it much, I didn't need to. It was just there in the quiet of my understanding, a small and solid thing. Grandma Rose's ring is for me *. I was 22 when she died. She'd had a stroke in November. It was fast, which the doctors said was a mercy, which I understood to be true and also hated them a little for saying. She was there and then she was not there, in the way that people you love are no gradual warning, no careful preparation, just the sudden and violent absence of someone who had been taking up the most important kind of space in your life. The funeral was held on a cold grey Thursday in December. I wore my grandmother's favourite colour, which was the deep green of pine trees in winter, because she told me once that black at funerals was a convention invented by people who didn't know how to express grief any other way. I stood at the graveside and held Petra's hand, and did not cry until I was in the car driving away, and then I cried for what felt like a very long time. And then I waited for the ring. I want to be honest about the waiting because I think it matters. I didn't wait greedily. I didn't wait with my palm out. I waited in the way you wait for something that was promised to you by someone who loved you, which is a particular kind of waiting, tender and sad and complicated. I wasn't thinking about the ring the way you think about a prize. I was thinking about it the way you think about a letter someone left you. I wanted to hold it in my hands and feel close to her. My grandmother's estate was modest. She didn't have much money, the house, some furniture, her garden tools, her books, her china, her clothes. My father, being her son, handled the legal matters. There was a will. I was not privy to the specifics of the will, which I understand is normal, but I assumed the ring would be mentioned. I assumed it clearly, the way I'd assumed it since I was 9 years old. My father came to my apartment. I was living in a city called Birchwood at that point, about an hour from Harlow Creek, working as a junior copywriter for a small advertising firm about 3 weeks after the funeral. He sat at my kitchen table, which was the kind of irony I only recognized later, and he had a cup of coffee in his hands, and he looked at the table for a long time before he looked at me. "Your grandmother didn't mention the ring in the will," he said. I felt something drop inside me, not collapse, drop, like something falling from a shelf. "What?" I said. "She didn't specify it. It's listed as part of the general estate jewellery." He paused. "Your mother and I have decided to keep it safe for now." I didn't say anything for a moment, and then I said, "She told me that ring was for me. She told me when I was 9. She said it again when I was 16. She told me again on my 21st birthday." My father nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he already knew something and was deciding how to handle knowing it. "I understand that," he said, "and I believe you, but there's nothing legally documented, and until we figure out what makes sense, we're going to hold on to it." I said okay. I said okay because I was 22 years old and I still believed that adults, real adults, parents, handled things fairly. I said okay because I didn't know yet what hold on to it meant in the long run. I went home. I sat in my apartment and thought about my grandmother. I thought about her hands, the way they looked when she told me stories. Gesturing and moving and alive. I thought about the ring on her finger, that deep blue stone, that smooth white gold. I said okay and I waited. I waited for 3 years. In those 3 years, a few important things happened. I changed jobs. I left the advertising firm and started working for a non-profit that did environmental advocacy work, water rights and clean air regulations, that sort of thing. The pay was worse and the work was harder, and I had never been happier professionally. It felt like doing something that mattered, which is the particular luxury of people who have decided that meaning is more important than money, which is a decision that is much easier to make when your basic needs are met, and much harder to maintain when they start to slip. I also met James. James is, and I genuinely struggle not to sound like a person in a romantic comedy when I say this, so bear with me, James is someone I did not see coming. I met him at a farmer's market on a Sunday morning, which is the most insufferably charming origin story for a relationship that I could possibly have, and I'm sorry, and it's true. He was buying tomatoes. I was buying lavender, because I'd started growing things in pots on my apartment balcony, because my grandmother had loved lavender, because grief finds its way into your hobbies. He was tall and had the kind of dark eyes that take a second to adjust to, and he was asking the farmer very serious questions about the tomatoes' sun exposure with an intensity that made me laugh out loud before I could stop myself. He turned around and looked at me, and his expression was exactly the right balance of offended and amused, and that was honestly that. We dated for 8 months before we said we loved each other, and both of us cried a little when we said it, which embarrassed us both enough that we laughed immediately after, which is probably the ideal conditions under which to say I love you for the first time. James knew about the ring. He knew about my grandmother. He knew about the Wednesday afternoons and the kitchen table and the storytelling, and the way her absence sat in my chest, not like a wound exactly but like a hollow, a space that used to be occupied by something warm. "The ring is yours," he said to me once simply when I mentioned it, not angrily, just factually, the way he said things that were true. He had that quality, the ability to state something true without any fuss around it. "I know," I said, "I think." "You know," he said. In those 3 years, Vanessa also announced that she was getting married. The man's name was Nathan Adler, soon to be Nathan Adler Calloway, because Vanessa was modern enough to want her name included and traditional enough to still want his first. Nathan was a financial analyst who wore slim trousers and drove a clean car and shook my hand very firmly the first time we met, which I always distrust slightly in men who aren't interviewing for something. He was fine. He was perfectly fine. He loved Vanessa, or he seemed to, and Vanessa loved him, or she seemed to, and who was I to interrogate the interiority of someone else's relationship? The wedding was planned for the following September. My parents were ecstatic in the way that parents are ecstatic about the weddings of children. They have poured the majority of their emotional resources into, completely, loudly, without reservation. Vanessa wanted a large wedding, 250 guests. A venue outside the city, a converted barn that had been renovated into something that cost more money than it had any right to, white florals and candlelight, and a string quartet for the ceremony. It was going to be expensive. Profoundly, extravagantly, bone-shakingly expensive. My parents did not have the money for this wedding. I knew this. Anyone who had been paying attention to my parents' finances for the last decade would have known this. My father's insurance business had been gradually shrinking in the age of online insurance comparison tools. My mother had never worked full-time. They had a mortgage and a modest savings account, and the particular willful ignorance about money that people develop when they have spent their lives spending slightly more than they earn. I learned what happened about 6 months before the wedding from my Aunt Linda. Aunt Linda is my father's younger sister. She is the family member most likely to tell you an uncomfortable truth, and the one most likely to follow it up with a hug and a piece of cake, which is a combination I have always found remarkably effective. She lives 40 minutes from Harlow Creek in a farmhouse with her husband Frank and 3 dogs she treats like small royalty. She called me on a Tuesday evening while I was making dinner and said, without preamble, "Ellie, I need to tell you something and I need you to hear it before you hear it from someone else." I turned the stove off. "They sold it," she said. "Your grandmother's ring. Robert and Diane sold it to help pay for the wedding." The silence that followed that sentence was the kind that has weight. I held the phone to my ear and I could hear my own breathing and the distant sound of traffic outside my window and Linda, on the other end, not saying anything else because there wasn't anything else to say yet. "When," I said finally, "about 2 months ago, I only just found out. I ran into your mother in Harlow Creek and she mentioned it in passing like it was nothing, like she was telling me she'd sold a piece of furniture. She said they needed to help Vanessa with the venue deposit, and the ring had just been sitting there so it seemed like the right thing to do." A pause. I nearly fell over. "Does Vanessa know?" "I don't think she knows where the money came from. I don't think she knows the specifics." I stood in my kitchen for a very long time after I hung up the phone. James was out that evening. I didn't call him. I just stood there and let it settle over me, this thing that had happened, this thing that had been done.